What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of That Creative Life. I am here with Amanda. We just met recently. I am so amazed by our ability to make a plan and just schedule it out. Now we're collabing.
You know, I try to like action the idea as soon as I have it. Either it goes into my to-do list or I'm like, you know what? I would like to talk to you. We met on Tuesday.
Was it? Yeah.
And it's Friday.
2 days ago, 3 days ago. I love it because usually it's one of those things where like, oh yeah, let's collab, let's hang out, and then just never talk to each other.
And I feel like it's a very New York thing as well. We were like, we should have lunch sometime. And then 6 months later,
Exactly.
it's like, do you remember me?
Exactly. But for some context, we met at this panel we were doing about podcasts with Simplecast and YouTube Space. And it was a really cool conversation around podcasting. And you have so much knowledge about the topic that I'm very excited to chat with you because I got a lot of creators out in the audience who are not only thinking about starting YouTube channels, but also forging this new path of audio and podcasting. So buckle up, guys, because you're about to get a free 45-minute consultancy with someone who I'm sure is very expensive. So thank you.
You're very
for
welcome.
being here.
You're very welcome.
But give us some background because I love that you started with YouTube back in the day, right? You were like an OG YouTube vlogger. Was it vlogging when you were doing it?
Vlogging had just been popularized as a term.
Okay.
And whenever it was in the news, people would still have like the parenthetical explanation of what YouTube was and what vlogging is. So I was a very early watcher of like Zay Frank and John and Hank Green and came
the
up...
Green Brothers.
Yeah, in the kind of like early nerd fighter community where a lot of people became video bloggers, not because it was like a career at that point, but because we were just like interested, creative, wanted to connect with each other and like jump into this really interesting, vibrant medium. So I was in high school at the time. I made my first video as a video response to, I think John made it on like Iran. And
I forgot there were video responses.
Yeah.
So guys, instead of leaving a comment on a YouTube video, you could literally leave a video response. I completely forgot about that.
There was not infrastructure for it. So you just like put it on your own channel and said like then they built infrastructure for it.
I remember seeing the little thumbnails underneath it of video responses.
I think maybe it was like if they approved your video, it could be listed as a response. So it was exciting just to like have potentially someone whose video you liked see your response, but also to make friends and like to have other people see you.
Community builder.
Yeah. So a lot of the people that I now count as like some of my best friends, I've known for more than 10 years at this point because we started out on YouTube in like 2007, 2008.
And you said you've been to 9 VidCons, the first 9 VidCons?
Yeah, the first one was the summer I graduated high school. So before I started college, I decided to fly myself from New York to California. My first flight on my own, my first flight across the country. Wow. And attended. And it was so exciting to see so many of the people that I knew from the internet in real life. My parents...
Was that the first VidCon? So it was in that hotel?
It was in the basement of the Hyatt Regency Century Plaza, I think it was called.
So I made a documentary about VidCon with some people and we went to that hotel and talked about it.
It was wild. It was just, like the euphoria of seeing the people that you knew from online in person for the first time. And there were panels, if I remember correctly, about like being in college and doing YouTube and like having a job and doing YouTube. And getting to, for the first time, educational YouTubers on a panel, teen YouTubers on a panel. And it was just so awesome. You like saw everyone's faces. We were all there for the first performance of Double Rainbow by the Gregory Brothers. And it was just such good memories.
I love the Gregory Brothers.
Yeah.
They're so cool. They're here in Brooklyn.
They are. I've had the like very weird opportunity to like be next to them at a party and just been like completely starstruck.
Have you gone to their ping pong parties?
No.
Apparently they have these ping pong get-togethers that I've always been out of town for them, but they're just like the coolest people ever.
That's awesome. It's great when someone who you hope is really cool is actually really cool.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. It's nice. And so I'm sure you experienced a lot of that in the beginning, and because I always hear about stories of that, and it's very interesting that you were a part of that. How many people originally were at the first VidCon? Do you remember?
I think it was fewer than 2,000. The second year was in the same location, maybe closer to like 3,000 or 4,000. Anyway, just for me, it became like a reunion that the one time every year I got to see so many of my friends in the same spot, and people, didn't make it one year. Other people joined and we got to know them for the first time. So it has just been like the bedrock of my life. And even throughout college, I found opportunities when I first got jobs in media. I convinced them to send me to VidCon, so I was able to go back even when I couldn't afford it on my own. So it was so exciting. And this year is the 10th VidCon. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to make it since I work now fully in podcasting and not in video.
Right.
But it's just been so wild to see it grow from, 1,800 people who pretty much knew each other to like 30,000 plus. Like the figures are astounding.
Wow. Who was, because, 10 years on YouTube, only a few people have been able to adapt and change. And, you're podcasting, you're doing something that's on the somewhat same level, but it's different. Mm-hmm. Do you have friends that have been able to continue, or were you hanging out with Shane Dawson some
Definitely
of the first
not.
VidCons? Was he? He was there since the beginning. I don't know.
I remember, I think the Shay Carl and his family had like 2 kids at the time, or maybe 3. Wow. But yeah, I definitely have friends who have persisted and stayed YouTubers. I think Akilah Hughes is a great example of someone who
I freaking
has
love her.
Adapted. Like I met her at a VidCon and was just like, oh my God, you're amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Back before she was famous. And and she's done, YouTube, TV, other kinds of film,
podcasting,
writing, wrote a book. She's a podcast. Like she's so multi-disciplinary because she's awesome, but also I think that's a necessity these days, is like you can't predict what's going to be in vogue 6 months from now.
So what was that point for you when you were like, oh, podcasting, that's the thing?
Well, I left YouTube first around, I guess, 2012 or 2013. For me, that was middle of college. It started to become really clear that you had to post really frequently to stay relevant. Like the daily vlog was really at its height, I think. And I was like working full time, putting myself through school at the same time. And I just had this moment of reckoning where as much as I wanted to make that work, I realized that like I wouldn't be able to, I'd have to like leave something, and I wasn't able to like drop a job or to reduce my course load, which I did think about. So
what type of videos were you making at the time?
Very much like inspired by the Green Brothers. So talking about like the stuff I was learning and books I was reading, places I traveled, collabs with other YouTubers. But I wasn't really into comedy. I couldn't really do tutorials. I didn't have the setup to do, or frankly, the like skill to do interesting like cinema or filmmaking. It was very much, I used the medium as a way to connect with people and to have conversations.
And,
So graduated school. I worked in finance for several years. I was a English major that then the only paid internship I could find was in finance, which is like messed up.
English major to finance.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That is
so
amazing.
In retrospect, it all makes sense because now I like run a creative business. So having the grounding in both. The other day I called my dad and I was like, damn it, Dad, you were so right. I should have minored in business. Like it is so useful. Damn it. But
I'm sure that's a very common parent thing to be, oh, you're majoring in English. But something that I've actually reversed my thinking on a lot of the college stuff. I'm a college dropout, but I came from if you're going to college, engineering. I was an electrical engineering major for 3 years. But the one skill that I'm so glad I have now is being able to write in a concise manner.
Yeah.
And all of the English classes that I hated really conditioned me into writing better. And it's probably the best skill that I've taken from my school years.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And in a lot of ways, YouTube, even though I didn't end up pursuing it professionally, knowing how to do basic editing, how to color correct a video, knowing a bit about like social media. And I mean, now these things are stuff that you can get masters in, right? Is like social media content creation and optimizing for SEO and like doing all these things that were so much like leveled up in. But at the time, it was much easier to get like a campus job because I could edit together a video of a lecture that the, like on-campus theater had and put it up on YouTube and tell them how to like not have the title have like .mp4 in it. So I credit YouTube in a lot of ways with like getting me on the track of a career. But to answer your original question, when I had graduated in 2014 and was working full-time in finance, like wearing a suit, like closeted, not showing my tattoos, I had long hair, like I felt a lot of pressure to really fit in a lot of ways. My little act of rebellion was like listening to wild podcasts on the way to and from work. And it was like This American Life and the kind of traditional podcasts that, rightly show us how much the genre can do, but also like weird experimental ones and like ones by people who didn't do this professionally. And it reminded me so much of the YouTube that I loved. And that inspired me because it was interesting people, making projects, not because they necessarily wanted to make a living, but because they thought it was a great way to connect with people. So that sort of led to me like loving it, getting obsessed with it, reading and listening to and watching videos of podcasters, and then launching my own in 2016, early 2016.
That's so cool, because I think a lot of those things start as maybe a yearning for a community or just doing something creative. But also, even if you're not getting the numbers, if you're not getting the things that you think you would get for it, the skill that you learn is so valuable, because you can really take that and do whatever you want with it, because people need video people need talented individuals who understand these mediums of social media and audio, and can be really a useful skill wherever you are. So I mean, that's the thing with YouTube. Yeah. Even if it's not your job, I think it's so important to at least try pursuing those things, because you can learn a lot in a very short amount of time. Yeah.
And it's also amazing to have and make friends while you're doing a creative pursuit, even side by side and not together. Like the editor of the first podcast that I created called Spirits is this guy, Eric Schneider, who I met on YouTube and was a really fascinating and like film technique oriented vlogger. And when I was talking about doing a podcast, I was like, yeah, I want to do it, but like I hate editing and, I don't really have time for it. And so he was like, well, I'll do it. And the only reason I'm in podcasting now is because I had a friend who had those skills, because we happened to meet in an area where we were both developing those, which is why I think like college is not right for everybody, but that can also be an advantage, is meeting people who are sort of similarly inclined. 100%. And then you carry those friends with you forward, or at a job or an internship that you really care about. But one of my like side hustles is resume editing. Because my first job was in recruiting. That was like the thing that a liberal arts person was qualified to do. So I like read hundreds of resumes every day for investment banking positions. And
so what do you look for in for those two people who want to be an investment banker? How can they perfect their resume? I mean, what were you looking for when you were doing that?
Well, I had to like learn what all those words meant, because I didn't know the difference between like finance and accounting, and those are different things. Right. So now I have this like bizarre, archaic knowledge of this. The system is very much like law. It depends what school you went to. Unfortunately, like it's really institutionally developed to exclude people. But I actually was most interested in people who had interesting jobs, like people who clearly like worked in order to pay their bills in college, or who had internships in like off the beaten track for finance kind of places. But the point being, like hiring somebody who has that level of business writing that's really creative and efficient, because they were a creative writing minor or a history major, or something like that, to me is an asset. Like there's tons of people who like went to the right schools and who got good GPAs and who had internships at like accounting firms, right? But the people who have that fascinating knowledge of like politics, that'll help inform your job. Or they have, again, a creative minor and they think creatively in ways that other people might not have the chance to develop. So to me, like the more kind of random your work history, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That can like help you gain skills that no one else has that particular mix of. And to me, that's like such a strong thing. Like I've worked again in like finance. I worked at a university helping students start businesses. So seeing people go through like the very many ups and downs of starting a company, and at like a tech startup environment, like figuring out how to rent an office and like do all the kinds of,
I mean, that's practical-ish right
wild
there.
Things. And looking at it at the time, I felt like I was such a like scatterbrained failure for like not pursuing one job track in the way that's we're traditionally taught to do. And
but I'm sure now you have a lot of useful skills that come into play.
Now I am uniquely qualified for the job that I have, which didn't exist 2 years ago, because I tried to find jobs that gave me a skill I didn't have before.
Right.
So that's often when people ask me for resume or just career advice. I'm like, don't worry about looking, disorganized, but think about where can I learn something that I want to know, because that is what, like when you look back and you have 5 jobs that each taught you like 5 different areas of expertise, like you are going to have some like Venn diagram overlap of skill that no one else is going to.
Oh, that's so good. And of course I want to get into what you're doing right now, but before that, a little bit more about the college thing. Yeah. When you were doing studying English, when you were doing these jobs before what you're doing now, was there any, because entrepreneur people, I feel like they're driven by this like yearning thing of doing something different, but it seems like you actually had like some really good jobs, maybe, a good experience in college, but kind of what were you doing as your side hustles during your time? Was YouTube taking up the majority of your time in college? And was there any overlap with what you were doing in college? And like, did you have any moments in your brain that you were like, maybe I should drop out of college, or what kept you in? I'm intrigued.
Yeah. I think a fear of failure made me not drop out of college. I like school, and I was always like a good student, and that for me was a very safe environment. And actually my first video blog ever was about being rejected from like the top 5 colleges that I applied to. I applied to them all, and then on the same day I got rejection letters from all of them. And so I sort of had this moment of reckoning where I was like, oh my God, I have to figure out what I want. Like it never occurred to me before. I just sort of thought like, okay, well, you go to the best school you can get into, and then you study something.
System,
yeah. And sort of reckoning with what I wanted to do and like finding a new life plan and kind of rolling with the punches was like an extremely formative experience. But that being said, at least being able to, I don't know, like get a job to support myself was really the only thing that I knew I needed to do. And I think looking back, it's easy to say like, I've always had a creative project, like YouTube really appealed to me. Before that, I was in like fandom, and I was a like different forum moderator. And I always just liked that kind of being organized and helping other people who really cared about a thing, like get the thing done. Which is why now, I do a lot of business and administration and like sales behind a podcast collective. So I help my colleagues who are like creative geniuses that want to make amazing projects. I do a little bit of that too, but mostly I like help them focus on what they find really valuable. And I kind of take care of like the silly details that they don't want to deal with. And that to me is the most fulfilling thing. But I didn't know that until I'm 27 now. And it has taken me really like 5 or 6 years post-college to find out.
And it's because people like you are so necessary. And I think, if I actually kind of zoom out on this podcast, I've recorded, I guess, like almost 50 episodes now. Usually it is the person on camera, the, very out there CEO, or, just the face of things. And there's all this discussion of like, oh, well, how did you do that? And how did you get here? And truthfully, a lot of times it is like a partnership of people, or it's a collective, it's a group of people that makes that happen. And I'm just thinking there's so many people in my life that support what I do, and it wouldn't be possible without them. And I think there's so many roles within these creative things that it doesn't have to be that on-camera personality. It doesn't have to be that you yourself, you do the podcasts, you're in them, but there's so much business and interesting things around it that I think people aren't aware of.
I mean, we don't talk about it. Like there's no like Wikipedia for jobs in creative industries. And some of my favorite panels at VidCon actually have been alternate careers in online video, I think was one of the titles, where like Caitlin Hoffmeister from Complexly and a couple of the editors that work there, Nick Jenkins, for example, were on the panel being like, yeah, like I'm an editor. I'm a business development person. I, do like makeup and hair. And there are some that map onto film that you know about. And these days there are so many more jobs in social media. Like you can specialize in writing content, in doing like optimization, in doing, ad sales for those platforms. Like there's this industry that just, there isn't a lot of opportunity to get to know what those roles are unless you work in them. which is why, again, like so many, I don't know, I kind of look at that generation before me on YouTube of the people who were popular when like I was getting started. And many of them will say, like John and Hank have said, like, we were just first. Like, we weren't particularly better than anybody, but we were just there at the right time. And like, they worked hard and they have talent and stuff like that as well. But so much of it really is timing. So I went through this crisis of feeling like I didn't want anything enough to pursue it. Like I didn't know what the dream was. But I just tried to like, I knew it was important for me to be creative and to make stuff. So I tried to make time for that and continue to prioritize it. But there's absolutely no way that I would be working like for myself if I didn't have the people around me whose vision drove me and who I could support. And like when I wasn't sure what I wanted, either just because I didn't know yet or like dealing with depression and anxiety throughout my life, you know, it's hard to stay motivated. So having kind of like the system to know, like, I'm not quite sure what I want. I'm not quite sure if this is all worth it or if I like what I'm making today, but I know at least that I am accountable to others. And even if I just make their lives a little bit easier, to me, that's like fulfilling enough to feel like I'm doing a good job.
Was that you just kind of being there? Like being around the hustle bustle, the people who are doing stuff? Because there's probably a lot of people out there that are in the shoes that you were in and are like, hey, I don't have these like I don't have this clear vision on what I want to do. All I know is I'm a fan of this world.
Yeah. How
do they get there? Is it going to the conferences? Is it following those people, engaging on Twitter? I mean,
I think that's a wonderful question. And being around physically certainly helps. Not everybody has the resources or the ability to do that, of course. Mm-hmm. But great news is like I'm an internet kid and I made most of my friends on the internet. And so participating in those communities, even if it's not like a thing you particularly want to make, like I read so much fan fiction, but I am not a prolific writer. So I love that community. I don't know any of these people's real names. I just know them as their pseudonyms, but I have like fandom friendships I've had for like 15 years. So that's just one example of, you know, it doesn't have like an economic output necessarily, but it still like feeds my soul and is really exciting. But it was through, you know, being in theater club in middle school is how I met my best friend who I started my first podcast with. Being on YouTube and like leaving comments and just being like a vocal fan is how I made a bunch of the friendships with people that I now make podcasts with. In college, it was, you know, being involved in a club within my department and meeting someone that I now have a D&D podcast with. So I think, you know, making time. And for me, my brain is always very much like, what's the justification here? Like, are you making money? Are you like, is this good for your career? You know, I always try to like have a realistic reason to do everything, but sometimes like doing something awesome and meeting people who share something in common with you, who are driven, who want to make stuff, who like care about the world and who share that perspective with you. You know, you might hear me say this and be like, okay, well, like I'm doing a bunch of stuff and I'm volunteering and, you know, I don't have that perfect co-founder or co-host for whatever it is that I want to do. But I think you can always like control the timing on these things. So I think just trying to ask yourself, like, am I meeting people with whom I share something really important? And it's easier when you move away from home. It's easier when you are an adult and have more autonomy. But even if it's like just on the internet, even if it's just on Tumblr, you know, quote unquote, or if it's just at
good old Tumblr
volunteering.
Days. Were you a Tumblr kid too?
Yeah. I only probably got it when I was like 17, so I wasn't a like preteen on Tumblr. I think I would have known I was queer a lot earlier because I would have had the vocabulary.
I mean, honestly, and I remember Tumblr being this this world that was so foreign to me, and it was so there were just like no filters. There were no anything. So you open up Tumblr and you have these, oh my God, beautiful pictures, animation inspo. But then, how did that picture of boobs come up on my screen? You know, it was like this kind of wild west of the internet, but kind of through this creative lens, which was interesting. They're kind of like not a thing anymore. But was it like YouTube? Were you at Twitter? Were you tweeting? Did that play a part?
I joined Twitter in late high school. That's actually how I kept touch with a lot of people that I now know from college. And like YouTube people, when the comments started getting less and less reliable, most YouTubers went to Twitter, and that's kind of how we kept up with each other. I guess the only platform that I'm not huge on or into is like Facebook and Pinterest. Those two I've kind of like like,
Facebook, I deleted
don't get
3
it as
years
much.
ago.
Yeah. You're early on the train.
Yeah.
That being said, there are a lot of Facebook groups, especially for like podcasters and fans of podcasts. A lot of the infrastructure for that community is on Facebook, but it's fascinating. Like, I'm very much an infrastructure nerd. I think if I'd went to grad school, it would have been in like media theory or like library studies and library science.
Interesting. Wait, what is that? What is library science?
It's like the profession of being a librarian. So you talk about like how to treat and disseminate data. And a lot of librarianship is like organization and preserving materials, and like books are degrading every day. They're like made on paper, and so are hard drives, and so are like all these different kinds of media that you have to preserve and make available for future generations. Is what like people with MSs in library science do.
That's a big job.
Yeah. But
putting it in that perspective.
It reminds me so much of Tumblr. Like, there's this great internet linguist called Gretchen McCulloch, who we just interviewed on my podcast Spirits, and wrote a book called Because Internet about the like language and systems of how we talk online. So she's like, hey, hashtags are for humor, and like adults making fun of them, you're stupid. And talking in internet speak is not like dumb parody. There are like rules and systems to like the Doge meme, and she puts linguistic systems onto like the actual subject of like internet speech, and it's fascinating. Her podcast is called Lingthusiasm, like enthusiasm but linguistics.
Love it.
It's very good.
Wow. Yeah. And so talking about structure and infrastructure, so with your podcast collective, it's really cool because it's kind of taking the idea of a podcast network, but definitely it sounds more supportive. It sounds more of like you are working alongside these podcasts. You are like 2 of them, or you're in them, right? Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the podcasts that are in your collective. What is about? What does it do? Tell me what it do.
So my company is called Multitude, and we're a podcast collective and also a consultancy. So that means that we make money by consulting with people, clubs, universities, companies, radio stations who need support in making and marketing their podcasts. So you can Google like how to market a podcast, and there's like 5 things, one of which I wrote, but there isn't a lot of support out there for, how do I like run a good podcast Twitter? How do I make good podcast art? What do you need? And unless you've been like obsessively listening to podcasts and reading every book about radio and podcasting, like I have and my colleagues have for so many years, it can be really hard to do that. So we publish a lot of free resources for people, not just podcasters, but creators of all kinds. Like we have a great accounting like spreadsheet that you can download for free if you want to keep track of like your side hustle income, stuff that I wish had existed when I was getting into all of this. Like I really want to like pay it forward to make it easier for people coming up behind me to get into this world. So we make money doing that by consulting with, various people outside of our collective, and by selling ads. So I worked for a year at like an ad sales startup, where I learned both there and then before as a YouTuber, watching my friends get these, sponsorship deals and like influencer money. It's fascinating. There are no rules to some extent, and there are a lot of advantages to like banding together with the 5 shows that Multitude contains, so that, any one of the shows individually might have 5,000 downloads. Another one has 6,000 downloads per episode on average. Some of them are bigger, but when we can go to a sponsor and say like, hey, across all of our shows, we have 2 million downloads a month. So, come on in and like, let's talk about how we can make a deal. The advertiser might not pay attention to any one of us on our own, but they will show up when we can say like, hey, let me use your time efficiently. Let me help you, and like sell an ad across all of us. So a small commission off of those sales also helps to pay the bills. But mainly the support we provide for each other is, we're 5 like independently owned podcasts that care about each other and about our audiences. So we cross promote each other. We pitch conferences and live shows, different live events. And again, it's very much like there's power in being together. And so that's what something like a traditional network will offer a show and say like, we'll spend lots of money on advertising. We'll like run ads for you across our other shows. We will use our advertiser relationships to like make you a lot of money. And if your show's not that big, they might not kind of give you that time. Yeah.
Everything. It's funny. All the questions that I had, you just said, so thank you.
Yeah.
But everything with the podcast network that is appealing to people is, I think, everything that you said, but then what you said, they don't deliver a lot of the time. So what about that world are you trying to change? the podcast network world?
No, it's a good question. I mean, you shouldn't have to be popular to have access to that kind of stuff. Like, you shouldn't have to make a super popular show or like work in an unpaid internship at an NPR station for 4 years in order to like get a job that pays you $30,000 in New York City. Yeah. Like, it takes a certain amount of privilege to rise up through the system in a lot of cases in that way. And there are tons of people without like on paper qualifications, much like early YouTube right now in podcasting, like making incredible stuff. Like, there's no degree in how to, you know, be a great podcaster.
It's interesting how podcasting has been a thing for good 10 years, but it's still 15.
Yeah.
But it still lacks a lot of the freshness that I think people have been bringing in for years and years. But it's almost kind of like there's still a pushback of traditionally of like how it's done or you know, in NPR, how many downloads are they getting?
Well, I think it's more like radio in the US, obviously like over 100 years old.
Right.
And there are these systems in place where like literally radio stations are like broadcast into your car and into your home. Right. They're on airwaves for free. And so a lot of people who like, they don't come to podcasting as a new art form they never heard of before. They first like find their favorite radio show on a podcast. And so I think it's less that there is like not appetite for new stuff or opportunity for indie people or newcomers, but that there's just it's hard to compete with someone who has like 100-year plus legacy of like making the stuff.
That's
and so many of them, they're making great stuff that aren't, that's inspiring to others. Like tons of them try to collab with indie shows. So that's all great. And, you know, being able to take like a workshop that is funded by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange, you know, is great for indie producers. But at the same time, you know, it's kind of on us as indie producers to educate people as to why they should care about shows by producers they've never heard of. Right. And so for a lot of us, that's like, you know, making great use of social media. And like, you know, one of our shows, the one I co-host, Spirits, is about mythology and folklore. So we post like classical art and mythology memes to Instagram and Twitter, right? And so we'll get in touch that way by just like sharing great stuff and being a kind of good member of the community. We'll just come across
the memes,
people.
Guys, that's the answer to everything.
It's not the answer to everything, but it does help in marketing sometimes. But just by like being interesting and interested in other people and their work, and by like raising up other podcasts and trying to kind of meet people who we think will be interested in our subject matter where they are, whether that's like a hashtag on Instagram or Audio Drama Sunday, which is like a day on Twitter where everybody shares their favorite fictional podcasts. You know, we try to like meet fans of our subject matter and not just necessarily podcast listeners. You can do both. But it's exciting because there's so much new work being done. There are so many listeners who, like, when you're a podcast fan, you are a podcast fan. And like, I subscribe to, I think, over 100 shows right now. Not everyone is that extreme, but for the most part, people who love podcasts just want more podcasts. Want more.
And I totally feel that because as a person who's doing it, sometimes I'll be like, oh, it's already so saturated. But as a consumer, once I'm done, I'm a very like, I love interview stuff. So once I'm done with Tim Ferriss show and like Masters of Scale, I'm pretty much like, wait, what else do I listen to? Like there's still...
And it's harder to find, but there are thousands of great interview shows.
Yeah, and it's interesting. What do you think about the... podcasts are still, there's not one central place. And I think that's what makes it great. But what is... Do you see something coming down the pipeline that's going to help the discoverability? Is that a thing that podcasting needs? Or the fact that it is the Wild West, is that a good thing?
There is a lot of people have like built our own answers to these problems. So when you like read the news about podcasting, you're going to read people saying like, oh, you know, there's these infrastructural problems. And some of that is true, but some of that is also because like the Wall Street Journal isn't necessarily going to report on like the amazing, you know, communities of like queer and non-binary producers making the content they want to see in their world, for example. They're going to report about like the business related stuff. So a lot of the perspective that like the mainstream audience has about podcasting is because the only access they have to reportage on this stuff is about the kind of like infrastructure and like technological shortcomings, because that's what companies want to like make, and they can make money off of like selling you a solution to it. So there is a ton of like indie responses to that. For example, there's this site called the Bellow Collective, which was started by a bunch of people working in radio at traditional places to lift up indie producers. So that's where I publish all my articles about how to podcast well. There is this great columnist who writes about audio fiction specifically, which is kind of a subgenre, but it's so vibrant and wonderful. So it's a place where like if you want to learn about indie podcasts, go read Bellow Collective, read like Discover Pods, read, Inside Podcasting, and a bunch of different websites that have kind of sprung up to fill this problem, or like a lack. But at the same time, like the more mainstream a thing gets, the less like intimate it is by definition. Right. So right now,
look at what happened on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly.
The shift happened so fast, I think, to very commercial. Mm-hmm. And very, people always, and things have to change and evolve. I mean, that's the reason why I can do what I can do because of that.
Yeah. And like mainstream interest means money, which means, resources and ability to like try new stuff and make a living doing it. And, if advertisers didn't think podcasting was like real enough to put money into, like I couldn't be doing this full time. But at the same time, like every time there's like a news story or like a BuzzFeed listicle that mentions one of our shows, we'll get a bunch of influx of listeners who aren't as invested in the community and in us as like our core fans. So we get lots of emails telling us to use the word like less, for example, or not to sound like women, and just like, it's not every listener, but the bigger a thing is, the more varied the people are. So it's really a fine line. And I would much rather have a smaller group of listeners that really cares and for whom like the stuff that we make is their absolute favorite thing than a kind of bigger audience who's kind of like, I'll listen to it, I won't listen to it, we'll get to it over time. Yeah. So
and there's value in that with, like the true 1,000 fans thing. And when it comes to monetization, and we talked a little about that on the panel, and I'd love to chat about it here. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people think they need crazy numbers mm-hmm. in order to start monetizing, right? Whether it's video or especially podcasts, like what you said. I think that's why there's big strength in numbers, and coming mm-hmm. in as a collective or a network, it really adds that value. But what are some of the ways that you guys have monetized in mm-hmm. maybe non-traditional ways? Yeah.
So Patreon is the main one. I was so delighted when Jack Conte started Patreon, mm-hmm. a YouTuber, making a solution that he didn't have in the world.
He's been on this podcast.
Yay, Jack. Woo, he's wonderful. Awesome. He doesn't have to be that good, but he is. Like
he's so
he
nice,
could be a jerk and will also be like, fair enough. Like, thank you for making the thing that you make.
Yeah.
But he's like, he's the bomb. Every talk that he gives, I'm just like, I don't know how to talk ever because this is so good. But
seriously, guys, look up his talks on YouTube.
Yeah.
He goes like all out with his slides, and they're structured, but there's heart in it. They're good.
I know. You could tell that he like rehearses so much that it doesn't feel rehearsed at all.
Exactly.
But so Patreon, we launched each of our podcasts with a Patreon link already. So we were able to make enough money to pay for the expenses of the show when we had like maybe a few hundred listeners. So it really, I was excited to have more than a couple hundred listeners, but it didn't have to be in the thousands and tens of thousands in order to be financially viable for us, because people would, commit their resources because they cared about the show, which I am so humbled by. And to this day, we make more money on Patreon than we do from ads across each of the shows. So that is kind of like the biggest slice of the revenue pie. The rest is from ads. And then from, as individuals, like my co-host on Spirits may do consulting as an actor or as a writer or as an editor. So each of us kind of like has a side hustle with the skills we've developed doing the podcast to like do for companies and for other people. But the ads, I'm a big fan of like less traditional sponsorship. So in podcasting, people tend not to care, advertisers, about the show unless you have more than like 10,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days of the episode being live. And even 10,000 can be a stretch sometimes. Some of them are just like, get back to me when you're at 50,000. Yeah. And it's disheartening.
That's something that personally I'm going through when I'm like so they'll average around 10, 12, maybe 15. Mm-hmm. And then I'll have like really good episodes do like 27 or 30. I've only had a few do that. And so me coming from YouTube world, I'm like, oh, that's on average, I'll have videos do like 40, 50. If they pop off, they can be hundreds, but like I have experience. I just thought, I was like, oh, okay, it's going to translate to this world.
Right.
But then I started getting like the podcast sponsorship inquiries for like $200 an episode. And I'm like, no, that's not worth it. What are you saying? So you're saying that 15,000 unique, creative, driven people who are very thirsty for knowledge, that's worth $200 to you?
Yeah.
I was like, so I'm kind of having this reckoning in that I don't know if it's maybe there needs to be also collectively more education behind it too. And I think, companies like you'll help that. Mm-hmm. But recently I've been very shocked with the state of and like you said, you said a lot of the agencies take a huge slice too.
Yeah. Some of them, I've seen agencies who are kind of like the middlemen, for those who don't know, between the content creator and the advertiser. The best, like all of our ad partnerships, I work with the company directly. So that's best because they are able to negotiate with you. They're able to like send you samples and like make sure that you know what you're talking about when you talk about the product. And then they don't take a cut because they're the ones paying me. But when folks are in the middle, some brokers are great. Others take like 80% of the cost. I've seen 80-20 in favor of the advertiser.
So insane.
Which is wild. It's wild.
How is it that way? And so maybe it's just because maybe it's been very concentrated to where, like the Joe Rogan podcast of the world, when they have 1 million downloads, Tim Ferriss 1 million downloads, mm-hmm. then, they're getting probably a decent rate for that, but then maybe even they're not getting paid what they should, and then it trickles down to us to where it's like $200 by the time. I mean, like realistically, like just getting into numbers, what should maybe a podcast has 20,000 downloads mm-hmm. a week? What do you think is a realistic rate? Like a fee? Yeah.
So the average in the industry is they measure it by what's called CPM. So the cost per thousand, or mil in Latin, that's why it's an M, but the cost per 1,000 downloads of the episode. And most of the time, I didn't know that. I've been using CPM left and right, and I didn't understand the M. Okay. I know. I'm just like it's just
learning things, guys.
Why does math use Latin so much? I couldn't tell you. But the average is between $15 and $30 per 1,000 downloads of the show. So you will say like, hey, don't pay me $15 for my message reaching 1,000 people. Like, what do you, the like sanity of that message,
that's crazy,
is a little bit off.
Yeah.
And the reason from the advertiser's perspective is, they are paying for 1,000 downloads, but maybe only half of those people actually listen to the episode. Maybe half of those people make it to the mid-roll ad.
That's where what's it called? IAB.
Yeah.
So
the Internet Advertising Bureau.
Yes.
So there are all kinds of like organizations like the IAB are trying to say like, hey, a lot of this guesswork, we're kind of getting to like lowest common denominator pricing because there isn't a lot of technology involved.
Right. Well, and they've also reached a point with the IAB standards, and they implemented it into Simplecast to where now the numbers that you see are the listeners, they're not the downloads. So now we do have the analytics to prove that people are clicking through and they're listening. Doesn't just mean that it's downloaded on their phone. So there is some hope on the tech side of it that we are reaching that point where there are analytics. So now how do we take that education back to the companies?
Yeah, a lot of
no pressure. Is that your job? I mean, that's your job, right?
Yeah, it is. And like, that's why I try to do so much speaking. Like I did a panel at PodCon this year with the two advertisers that I work with most.
Cool.
And which is one of my co-hosts and myself. They work at a marketing firm called Right Side Up, which is a fantastic marketing firm. They've worked with like Quip and Stitch Fix and Calm, the app, a lot of names that you might have heard.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was talking to Dane from Simplecast yesterday, and he was like, "Oh, we work with Simplecast, maybe." And I was like, "I'm literally wearing Simplecast right in front of you."
Stitch Fix.
Stitch Fix.
Yeah.
Let's go. They're also at Stitch Fix.
At a podcaster convention, you'll see like the bomber jacket everywhere. Yeah, it's great. But I had a panel with them because like you don't hear podcasters and advertisers talking side by side ever. And so a lot of this is educating the advertisers. And most of the time, like it's a marketing person who's in charge of like influencer outreach or like digital marketing. And they are like overworked, underpaid. Their boss is like, show me results, man. And the person is just like trying to spend money in a way that won't make them lose their job. And so from that perspective, like I have a lot of compassion for advertisers who are like, I don't know, man, like I want to give you money. And a lot of the time their job
heavily result driven,
exactly.
I guess. And the point, and see,
So there's hope, right? So like
there is
yeah.
hope, but I think it's crazy though that same boss will validate $1 million budget for a TV commercial that you can't prove converts at all.
Yes.
So it's like these different mediums. There has to be this education awareness about when you're on a platform or like a YouTube, a podcasting that does actually convert. People are clicking that link, but also you have to make the play of the awareness play.
Yeah.
Because I'll watch a YouTube video and it'll be sponsored by someone. I'll be like, oh, that's cool. Interesting. But then I'll see it at a Target and I'll buy it at Target instead of through their link. So you have to take these mediums for what they are, but at the same time, they still have a lot of that traditional value of awareness that people are way overpaying in TV.
Yeah. We call that like a hearts and minds campaign sometimes where, they might be advertising like dish soap to me or like a dishwasher canisters, right? Like I don't have a dishwasher. I'm not going to probably have one for like 5 or 10 years if I ever like move out of New York City. But when I do, I will have like 3 decades of advertising in my head tell me which brand is best.
And that's why squarespace.com, if you need a website.
I know. Well, actually, I was having this argument with a sponsor the other day where it was a service that was like a bank account. It wasn't a bank account, but it was like a bank account where like you don't open one every day, right? Like you probably will open one like once every 3 years. And when you do, you're likely to stay with that service for a long time. But if I have an ad today and the advertiser the following day was like, hey, I haven't seen any signups yet. And I was like, give it a minute. Like this may, I was trying to, in a very polite and constructive way, be like, hey, I think this is going to have a long tail. I think it's going to be a slow burn. We are reaching people who haven't done this yet. A lot of our audience are like young women and non-binary people in their 20s. And so a lot of us are kind of like just coming into the phase of life where we're going to be like buying these things for ourselves, whether it's a website or a bank or
3 months of pounding that in their head. When the time comes to open up said thing, they'll be, oh, yeah,
exactly.
I'm going to go to this website.
So it's hard. And like a lot of the time, again, it's this person who's spending money with you and they're already in such a like nervous point of view, and attitude. And they're very much driven by like worry. So so much of it is communication. Yeah. And speaking about previous jobs, I worked a ticket window at NYU where I went to school. And there were people like running up to me being like, you sold me a movie ticket that was wrong. And I was like, no, I sold you a voucher that you can give to the movie theater to get your ticket. And now they like can't see Avengers today. So a lot of the experience of just like, like having a person who's so upset, be upset in your face and then being like, thank you for your feedback, and just like developing that instinct helps me a lot. Yeah. But to bring this back to kind of what podcasters can do or creatives of all kinds, we're talking about how it's so hard right now in podcasting to put a dollar amount to how many sales you think this spot is going to bring. But there is a way to have that information before you start. So I'm a huge fan of like profit sharing arrangements. So no matter what size your blog, your Instagram account, your podcast is, your YouTube channel, you can, let's say, work with a small business and say, hey, why don't we set up a discount code for my audience, and every sale that drives to your website from this discount code, let's share the profits. Right? Or the company knows the cost per acquisition of a customer. So like Casper Mattress, for example, might want to spend like almost $100 to acquire a customer because the mattress is a big purchase, right? Whereas a phone app might want to spend 2 cents per acquisition. So there's this huge range. So maybe it's a, high-end subscription box that will pay you $50 per every sale. That adds up over time. Like you would only have to sell
subscriptions. Yeah. You just have to make that one sell and then it goes on for years potentially.
Yeah. So you being able to work with the sponsor and say like, hey, I realize that you don't want to like throw money into the void. I also don't want to make no money ever, even if my episode gets really big and I didn't anticipate it. So, being open, especially working with fellow small businesses and fellow independent business owners, and having either a payment per sale or a profit share on the sales that you do drive.
Personal affiliate marketing.
Yeah. And then there's less risk. So the sponsor isn't laying out money that they're not sure if they're going to make back, and you are not taking on a spot at a price that you think is going to be less than you deserve. So I actually wrote an article called DIY Sponsorships about how to sell sponsorships yourself and like how to do this math about what rates to charge, how to put together like a sponsor deck and all the stuff that no one teaches you, but you need. So I think that it really is just like sharing resources and trying to come up with creative solutions at like the one-on-one level where, the like giant advertising agencies of the world are always going to think that they have all the power and all the connections. But in the meantime, the rest of us are like living our lives and figuring out really creative ways and solutions for these problems that probably the big companies are going to adopt 5 years from now. Right. So, that is how I've always been. That's how I try to be now, is kind of documenting and sharing all the things that I'm learning with my peers of all sizes. But that's the main message that I have a gripe with when I read all these like articles about podcasting, and they think that like the only ones worth mentioning are the giant ones. And they talk about how, the community is like super small and no one cares. Like there's millions of listeners for whom podcasting is their whole life, and we care very much. Yeah. So I don't know, that. The narrative is never gonna include
are you sick of hearing
the whole thing?
Gimlet this, Gimlet.
Yes.
Because honestly, that was kind of my gateway into podcasting, was the startup podcast. And I, as being, around the same age as you, I never had that kind of a weird transition where I wasn't into radio. I mean, I kind of just skipped over that. And so
I never had a radio.
Exactly.
My car had one, but I never owned one growing up.
So I never understood kind of like the legacy brands, and that podcasting really does overlap with, radio. So I thought it was this like crazy new thing when I discovered like the startup podcast, and they were storytelling. It wasn't just sitting down and talking.
For me, it was This American Life that I heard at like a friend's dinner table when I visited them in DC. And I was just like, what is this? Like, it's amazing.
It's crazy, right? Yeah. And so I guess it takes those mainstream people to kind of like, oh, interesting, this is a whole world.
But then the major brands, right, that'll read that and be like, this podcasting thing has legs, I think. And then they will put more money into advertising, or they'll give the people at their company who have been petitioning for podcast ads like, oh, you have an idea there, okay, fine. So there's pros and cons, that kind of high profile thing. At the same time, it makes people
that's an interesting problem. How do you find these niche podcasts that, I mean, listener out there could be the perfect podcast for you out there. They just don't know how to find it. So I think the most interesting thing we'll see over the next few years is everyone coming in and trying to control podcasting and make it this centralized thing to solve these problems. But then at the core of it, I don't think podcasting is that. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, podcasting is so intimate. That's why I love it. It's, me on my commute with my headphones listening to one story, right? Like it's that reporter showing me their version of a story, or it's, two best friends talking about subject matter. It's somebody like sharing something about their upbringing and their perspective that is brand new to me. And I love that so much. And
can you talk about the different like types of podcasting? Cause like, honestly, I used to think it was one of two things. It was either the interview vibe, or it's the storytelling thing. I had no idea that audio fiction was a thing.
Yeah, audio fiction is amazing. It's like audiobooks that people make in serialized installments. So there are so many that are so good. One of my favorites is called Our Fair City. There's one called Greater Boston. A lot of them are paranormal. A lot of them are about space. There's a lot of queer and feminist representation, kind of telling stories that we don't see reflected elsewhere. So the Bellow Collective has a wonderful reporter named Elena Fernandez-Collins who writes a monthly roundup of audio fiction that is really, really worth listening to. But apart from that, there are, there's like speculative fiction. There are people who have like really experimental audio and like use audio in the same way that we use film to tell stories. Like they use audio and music and, sound cues and like pacing to tell a narrative. Radiolab is often the thing that people cite as being like, wow, I didn't realize that audio could be like, you can use audio that isn't just people talking to build a mood and tell a story. So again, a lot of the time it's these legacy institutions, showing the mainstream and like educating them on how things can be different. But at the same time, there are the indie people who've been doing this for years and years. And so often we'll be like, oh, this major studio just launched a fiction podcast like Gimlet did. And the news media is like, they invented a new thing. And people are like, it's literally been around for a century. Like, what are you talking about? So it's always a disconnect.
Me being like, oh, I've never heard anything like this before. And then you discover, oh, wait, there's a lot of people doing it.
But to bring it around to discovery, a lot of podcasting where it's individuals doing projects, it's individuals getting to know each other, making a collective, like recommending shows to one another. The best way to learn about new podcasts is to ask your friends who love podcasts what they listen to. And stuff like Bellow and Discover Pods can step in for that too and recommend you new shows if you're the only person you know who listens to podcasts. And podcasters, like the best way to grow your show is to have friends who you can go on their show. You can have them recommend yours, and to get in front of other audiences who you know are probably going to like the kind of stuff that you do. But, I am all for more investment in podcasting. I'm all for more people taking it seriously and trying to help it grow. But I hope we never lose that feeling of, we are here making stuff that we really love because we want to. We're not driven primarily by economics. We're not driven primarily by wanting to like get Sandra Bullock or somebody like in my, audio drama. But we're here because we like care about this community. And as long as the people who invest in it care about it, and they're not just like a venture capital bro looking for a quick return, that I think is what's going to really matter. Yeah.
I never even thought about that, casting for podcasts. Are there celebrities that are going into like big production podcasts? And
often it's the podcast networks, like Gimlet is one example, where they think the only way to get people to listen to fictional podcasting is to cast people that they already know.
Gotcha.
There is a huge community of like voiceover actors and podcasting actors who do this for a living and are extremely good at it.
Gotcha.
So I would love to see
a mix
just
of
in
that,
general,
not just like traditional coming over and taking over that too.
Exactly,
guess,
because as with anything, you want to understand and respect a medium that you are stepping into before you just like announce that you're about to take it over.
Right.
And especially I think in like digital media, there is this feeling of like everything is brand new. And as soon as I hear it, like that means it never existed before.
Yeah.
But reading and like, again, becoming a good citizen of the community that you want to be a part of before you start making stuff, I think is so important.
Yeah.
Like there are lots of people who don't listen to podcasts and who want to make one just because they think it's cool, which, I respect the enthusiasm, but also there's so much here to know and love and learn about. So I think that anyone
and
who wants
to be a consumer of it. I mean, it's such a fun medium. And me personally, I've learned so much from it. And I didn't know there was this world of people just giving out advice for free.
Yeah.
And when I discovered that, I was like, oh my gosh, it's like a never-ending fountain you can drink from. It's so fun.
And especially, if you have like niche interests or marginalized identities and oppressions, like finding people who share something with your experience or who are talking about an experience that you haven't had, I think it's just a wonderful way to like build empathy. Yeah. And that for me was what vlogging was all about in the early days as well. Like it was amazing to me that I could watch someone like in their childhood bedroom in their parents' home in like Amsterdam, right? Like talk about what their life is like. And I'm just like, well, like it's amazing. So the internet, it like makes your world so much bigger, but hopefully it's there to foster like one-on-one relationships and empathy and intimacy and kind of all the stuff that like the grown-ups think that we can't get from the internet. I'm just like, I'll show you. Like I'll become a better person because of the internet, and no like alarmist headlines can tell me otherwise.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. So, this was such a good conversation. I felt like I blinked and now it's over, which is so sad, but thank you so much for joining. And of course, all the links and stuff, I'll link articles and all the things down below in the show notes. But if the people don't make it there, where can they find you on the social media? I am at She's So Mickey on Twitter. It's also my YouTube channel where I tend to do a month of vlogging once a year. So I'll have 30 new videos a year. Wow.
Yeah. So my last one was in October of 2018, and I talked all about quitting my job, having burnout, launching a company, doing all the stuff that I am now doing. And my website is multitude.productions. So if you have Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other podcast player, just type Multitude in and you'll see the 5 shows that we make. We have shows about the culture of basketball, about a fictional show, storytelling in Dungeons and Dragons. My show Spirits is about mythology and folklore through a feminist lens. There's one called Potterless, where a grown man reads Harry Potter for the first time. And then a show called Waystation, where we rewatch this amazing cult classic on Netflix that not enough people know about, called Lost Girl. It's like a supernatural sort of bisexual succubus main character solving crimes, and it's great. So all of it is about bringing a like enthusiastic but still nuanced perspective to stuff that we love. So that's Multitude.
Woo! Love it. Thank you so much for being here.
My
everyone.
Pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to hit that subscribe button I'm so used to YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, Apple Podcast, Spotify, so that Creative Life is in your app every single Monday. I'm trying every single Monday.
Yeah.
I try to get there.
It's important.
Exactly. And thank you so much, everyone. See you in the next one.